Carl Whitfield had his coffee cup halfway to his mouth when he heard the new manager ask Eugene Holloway to show her his wallet. He set the cup back down. 2 stools over, Eugene sat where he always sat, in the worn green vinyl seat closest to the register, hat resting on his knee the way it always rested, hands folded on the counter the way they'd been folded every weekday morning for longer than Carl had been coming in himself. The young woman behind the counter, new, 3 weeks new, name tag reading Brenda, had her hand out, palm up, like she was asking a child to hand over something he'd taken. "It's just policy," she said, "for certain customers. We've had some trouble lately with checks that don't get paid." Eugene didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't reach for anything. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, steady and unhurried. The way Carl imagined he'd looked at 1,000 worn-out heels and busted soles across 40 years bent over a cobbler's bench before his knees gave out and he closed the shop. "I've had the same order every morning for 31 years, Eugene said. His voice didn't rise. 2 eggs, scrapple, rye toast, black coffee. You can ask anybody in here. "I'm sure that's true," Brenda said, in the tone people use when they are sure of no such thing. "But I'd still need to see some." Or, Eugene said, "I can wait by the door while you find somebody who'd know better than to ask me that." He picked his hat up off his knee and started to rise. "Sir, I'm not trying to. There's a table in the back, by the kitchen. If you'd be more comfortable there," Brenda said, talking faster now, the way people do when they sense they've already lost a room they didn't know they were standing in. "That way I can keep the counter open for." She paused, hunting for some way to finish the sentence that wouldn't sound like what it was, and didn't find one. "For paying customers." Something in the room changed when she said that. Carl felt it before he understood it. A kind of pressure dropping low and steady, the air going still right before storm breaks. Carl had been coming to the wagon every weekday morning for going on 19 years, ever since he'd retired off the floor at the foundry. And in that whole stretch, he could not remember a single morning Eugene Holloway hadn't already been sitting in that seat when Carl walked in. Eugene got there first. Eugene always got there first. They nodded at each other for 2 decades, traded a word about the Phillies or the weather, and Carl had never once thought to call that anything but ordinary. He told himself this wasn't his business. He told himself the girl was young, probably just repeating something somebody else had told her. He told himself a lot of things in the 4 seconds it took Eugene to stand all the way up, and every one of them was a way of staying quiet, and some small, honest part of him knew it, even while he was thinking it. 2 stools down, Doreen Pruitt set her fork against her plate without finishing her bite. She'd carried mail on this street for 30 years before she retired, knew every face on the block by name, and her face had gone tight and still. In the booth by the window, a man in his 30s with a toddler balanced on his knee, Miguel Ruiz, who usually only came around on Saturdays but had stopped in before a job interview, looked up from buttering toast and went quiet too. Eugene stood very still with his hat in his hand. "I'm a paying customer," he said. "I've been since this was Mott's, before your boss's father bought it off, old man, Mott in 1995. I've sat in this seat through 3 remodels and a fire in the kitchen that closed the place for 6 weeks, and I came back the morning it reopened. I don't say any of that to argue with you. I say it because you asked me who I am, and that's who I am." He turned, unhurried, and walked toward the door, not storming off, not dragging his feet either, just walking the way a man walks when he's decided something and isn't going to make a performance of it. He lowered himself onto the bench by the coat hooks, set his hat back on his knee, folded his hands, and waited, looking out at the parking lot like a man waiting on a bus he already knew was coming. That was when Carl put his cup down for the 2nd time and stood up. "Brenda." He said her name carefully. He'd heard Frank use it maybe twice since she started. "I've had the stool next to that man, 5 mornings a week for 19 years. I buried my wife 2 years ago, and he was at the funeral in a good suit, sitting in the 3rd pew, and I never once in my life asked him to prove he could pay for a cup of coffee." Brenda's chin came up, defensive now, her hands twisting the order pad. "I'm doing what I was told to do. The franchise group that bought into the building next door sent over a whole training packet about walkout losses, and I was told it applied to us too. I'm not trying to be unfair to anybody. I could lose this job if I don't follow procedure." "Then go find out whose procedure that actually is," Doreen said, sliding out of her booth. because it isn't Eugene Holloway's. I have watched that man tip 20% on a $4 breakfast every single day since before half this town had a cell phone. Miguel stood too, shifting the toddler onto his hip. He fixed my boots once, he said. I was 9. My dad had just died, and my mom didn't have the money that month, and he fixed them anyway and told her it was store policy for the Ruiz family. No charge. He looked at Brenda, not unkindly, but not giving an inch either. There isn't a person who's lived in this town 20 years who doesn't have a story like that about him. Ask anybody at this counter. From the kitchen pass-through, the cook, an older man named Pete who rarely said 3 words to anybody, leaned out with a spatula still in his hand. I'll tell you mine, he said, but it'll take longer than your break's gonna allow. Brenda looked from Carl to Doreen to Miguel to Eugene, sitting patient on the bench by the door, and something in her face started to give the way a face gives when a person understands, all at once, that they've made a mistake bigger than they first thought, and there's no quiet way out of it left to find. I didn't know any of that, she said, quieter now, her voice catching. I've only been here 3 weeks. I genuinely thought I was following the rules. There were never any rules like that, Doreen said. Not here. Not ever. It was right about then that the bell over the door jingled, and Frank Delaney walked in still smelling faintly of lake water, tackle box in one hand, 2 weeks of vacation beard on his face, home a full day earlier than anybody had expected. He stopped just inside the door, taking in the strange shape of the room. Eugene sitting on the coat hook bench in his hat and coat like a man waiting for a train, half the regulars on their feet, his brand new manager standing frozen behind the register with an order pad crumpled in her fist. Eugene, Frank said slowly, why in the world are you sitting by the door? Eugene told him. He told it the same way he'd told Brenda. Flat, unhurried, no heat in it all, just the facts set down one after another like a man laying his tools back in their case at the end of a long day. Frank's face moved through 3 or 4 things while he listened. Confusion, then understanding, then something that looked almost like physical pain. Brenda. Frank's voice stayed quiet, but it carried clean to the kitchen door, and Pete leaned out a little farther to listen. That man taught me to tie a fishing knot when I was 11 years old, sitting at this counter, because my own father was always too busy running this place to do it himself. He has eaten breakfast here longer than you have been alive. There is no cash up front policy. There has never been one. Where did this come from? The training materials from the group next door, Brenda said, very small now. I thought applied to us too. I didn't think to ask. I don't want to get this job wrong in my first month. This isn't a franchise, Brenda. It's my father's diner, and now it's mine, and the only policy this place has ever had is that everybody gets a seat and everybody gets treated decent. Every single morning, no exceptions, no certain customers. Frank crossed the room and stood in front of Eugene's bench, and for a second nobody in the diner said a single word. I'm sorry. I'm sorry this happened in my own place, with my own staff, while I was off catching nothing in particular 3 hours up the lake. Will you come finish your breakfast? Eugene considered that the way he considered most things, without hurrying it. Then he stood, settled his hat back on his head, and said, I'll finish my breakfast. But she needs to hear it said plain that what happened this morning isn't who we are around here. And she needs the room to learn it, the same as anybody gets the chance to. It was, Carl thought, exactly the kind of thing Eugene would say. Not asking for anybody's job, asking only for the truth to be spoken out loud, and then asking for a little mercy on top of it. Frank gave Brenda that talk himself in the back, loud enough that nobody pretended not to hear it through the thin kitchen wall. There would be a real conversation, a formal note in her file, and retraining on how every regular got treated, starting that afternoon. No more certain customers, no policy borrowed from a business that had nothing to do with this one. She would keep her job. She would not get a second chance at the same mistake. By the time she came back out front, her eyes were red, and she walked straight to Eugene's seat and refilled his coffee herself, the pot not quite steady in her hand. By the end of the week, Frank had a small brass plate screwed into the counter under that stool. Plain, 2 lines, nobody's business but Eugene's. Eugene Holloway's seat since 1995. Breakfast was on the house that morning, and every Friday after, for as long as Eugene cared to come in and collect it, which, knowing him, would likely be every Friday for whatever years he had left. Carl thought about it for a long time that night, longer than the thing probably deserved, except that it did deserve it. 19 years he'd sat 2 stools down from a man he respected and never once said a word out loud about it. Not because he thought poorly of him, never that, but because saying things out loud had never struck Carl as necessary. Not until the morning it was. It had taken him maybe 4 seconds too long to stand up. He turned that over more than he turned over anything else from the whole morning. The 4 seconds where he might have stayed put, the way he'd almost done, the way it would have been so easy to keep doing. He didn't generally make a habit of saying what he thought when nobody had asked. But the next morning, and every morning after that, when he came through the door of the wagon wheel and saw Eugene Holloway already in his seat, hat on his knee, coffee already poured, Carl made sure to say good morning loud enough for the whole counter to hear. It wasn't much, but it was something he'd never once thought to do in 19 years, and he intended to keep doing it for as long as the two of them kept showing up.